Good morning. My name is Luke Hendricks, and if I haven't met you, I'd love to. Shake hands and connect a name and a face would be great. I am an interim pastor here at Heritage Park for the foreseeable future as the next local lead pastor. The whole search team is in search of that person. And I get the pleasure of being with you on Sundays and during the week with the staff, so I'm grateful for that. I am on loan from Northwest Gospel. I have a staff position over there as well, but now assigned here in this interim period, and I'm really grateful to be here and to get to know lots of you, so thanks for welcoming me. This morning, we're in Psalm 121, so you can certainly turn in your Bible or your phone or whatever. We're going to be there in just a second, but I want you to think for a moment, if you would, about a time in your life that you faced danger, danger of this world, and you felt as if you were all alone. That feeling that has some panic, but also a deep sorrow that no one understands me or understands what I'm going through. Perhaps it was from circumstances beyond your control, situations with impossible odds, confusing, seemingly unresolvable environments. It's excruciating. It's darkness, it closes in, and it feels very unsettling. So, when your world turns dark like that and your journey turns rugged, where do you turn for help? Where do you go? Who do you seek out? What is the source for the confidence you need to face those severe headwinds of life? Here's the truth. The journey towards God and with God never occurs in a vacuum, meaning we live our lives here on earth as human beings with all of the temptations and toils and problems that come with it. And we're to walk towards God and journey with Him. And it would be great if the path was quiet and reflective, peaceful, and we were allowed to journey at a comfortable pace. But that's not the way life works. It's usually frenetic and chaotic and lots of input coming from all kinds of sides. And it feels more like not a solitary walk on a pathway, but just walking through the middle of a tornado or some thunderstorm, complete with ear-splitting thunder and lightning. I don't know what this pilgrim who wrote this psalm was thinking, but he certainly writes in response to the challenges that he was facing, both in the moment and probably in his life as a whole, generally. But it's interesting that in this passage, the psalmist exudes a confidence that is strong and pure and very simple, based on his convictions concerning the character of Yahweh. We'll look at it here in just a second, and I'll read the whole of it back to you, just to steep in it for a moment. But I want to recall a moment in time for me that was very dark and very rugged. I was 24 and a half years old. I got married at 20. My wife and I, in those 4 years, were pregnant 4 times and had 3 children. You're asking, how does that happen? And I said, well, it's the water, actually. Whatever water we were drinking, I'm sure was the problem. But it was very interesting to be young and having those kids. And the 4th child was an interesting situation. We were living in Central Oregon, and there was a doctor in Bend who was world-renowned, actually, had OBGYN that had knowledge and a couple of things that he had brought to the whole discipline there that had given him recognition in a broad sense. And he was our doctor. And Donna was seeing him through her pregnancy. And we didn't know exactly when conception occurred. We couldn't figure that out completely, so they're monitoring her and measuring the baby as she's going forward with pregnancy. And it gets to a spot where now the doctor has some words for us that are really critical. And I'm sitting with my wife in this examination room, and he comes in and explains that the baby's head is too big for this stage. And said, most likely, this is hydroencephalitis, that the brain has fluid on it and is affecting, obviously, the size of the skull, but restricting the growth of the brain. And when this occurs, depending on what stage, it produces developmentally disabled children to lesser and greater degrees. And he's explaining that to us, and we're listening and pretty confused in the moment, don't know what to think. It gets worse. And I want to be careful here, but what he implied at that point was the head was so large that he predicted that if she were to give birth naturally, the head would collapse in the birth canal and the baby would die. And it would almost seem as if there was some mercy in that he was explaining to us, because otherwise you would have this very disabled child. I was 24 and spinning. It was worse, though, to look into the face of my wife, who obviously was spinning too. The information came so fast, and it's desperation on her face. And I'm trying to provide something that would be comforting, but it's not going too well. I didn't know what to think or what to say. I tried to gather my thoughts, and I pulled the doctor out into the hallway and just said, okay, listen, I don't know what's going on, but we're going to have this baby, and we want the baby alive, so what do we need to do? And he said, well, obviously you can have a cesarean section, and the baby would most likely survive. And I said, okay, that's the talk that I want. I don't want any other talk at this point. It probably didn't come out that cogent, but I'm all just kind of fired up. So you would think, we were young in our faith, but you'd think that would be a moment when you would turn to God and pray. And I don't know I think we both had the same thought. We need to call mom. We need some reinforcement here. And we called my mother and asked if she would come, or she probably offered to come. And so she did, and spent 2 weeks with us. But the next 2 weeks would involve a bunch of tests to figure out what was going on for sure. Our first inclination wasn't to pray. Our little church that we were attending prayed, though. Those people prayed. Where do you turn in that moment? I think all of us, as human beings, look to finite resources. I don't know why that's the first thing, but let's call mom. Well, mom got up here, tests hadn't happened yet, and that didn't really solve much. We were still in the same situation. And as a young parent, I can remember it multiple times in my life of crying out to God, not knowing what to do. Simpler situations, but this was excruciating. And so we leaned into each other, and we did our best to lean into God. A rugged time, a really dark time. Now, what happened in the story? Well, Donna had tried to communicate at an earlier stage that she had big babies, but it kind of fell on deaf ears. But after the testing was done, it became known that there was no hydroencephalitis. Kind of adjusted the due date and all that, and Adam was born at 10 pounds, 2 ounces. Big, healthy child. But that excruciating moment was part of the rugged journey. Now, I don't know what the psalmist is thinking, this pilgrim, but here, let me read it to you again, what he has to say. Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem, doesn't matter where you start from in Israel, is uphill at the end, because that's where Jerusalem is, up kind of tucked up in the hills, coming from any angle. And so uphill was always the way they were going to Jerusalem. And these Psalms, 120 to 135, 15 of them, are the Psalms of Ascent. And they were giving hope for the journey, for sure, which is the title of this sermon, but they were confessional. The people would recite these, singing them to each other on the way up. These songs made claims about God and about themselves and the world in which they lived, and they were meant to support and encourage each other. I've preached many sermons in my lifetime, but I would argue that what Ashley and her team did this morning will be more impactful to your individual theology. When the songs are true and sung by the people of God, somehow that sticks in your brain and your theology is established. And that would be true for the pilgrims heading up to Jerusalem, singing these songs with great confidence. So Psalm 21 is meant to encourage us in those rugged journey moments. It reminds us of where our help comes from and infuses us with confidence. So, verses 1 and 2, a pilgrim's question and a confident answer. The mountains are enigmatic. They're rather mysterious. I told you it's uphill to Jerusalem. So do they represent refuge? Because God had said, I will put my name there in Jerusalem and I will be present in the temple. So there could have been a sense of anticipation from the psalmist that way, like, oh, this is refuge. I lift my eyes to the hills. But more than likely, it meant danger. Danger. The situation, I don't know. It's only known to him what he was in, but he's looking with great anxiety at Jerusalem and going uphill to it. The hills would provide cover for mobs and vagabonds and bandits and those that could ambush these unsuspecting pilgrims who didn't have any weapons to defend themselves and who could cause great harm to travelers. So the question is asked. He looked up. Does it come from the hills? And the answer, where does my help come from? Not the mountains. But it comes from the one who made the mountains. I know, it's simple. Actually, it's creation language that we find in Genesis of who has created everything. It's actual language it's the opening line to the Apostles' Creed. It's seminal to us as Christians. And it's necessary for us to recite because we're prone to fear, aren't we? To being afraid. In moments of crisis, we need to experience our theology. Not simply speak it, but know it at a deep level inside of us. We need to work our theology of God into our hearts. not just simply our heads. This is the time for dependence on the Lord in a hostile world, when you're in one of those dark moments or a rugged journey. So this language from creation theology is to affirm that Israel's God is the maker of heaven and earth. So as soon as the question floods his soul, the writer comforts himself with the thought that Yahweh, the covenantal God, the one who promises to his people and never breaks a promise, has committed himself to provide help to his own. This one who is Yahweh, the maker of heaven and earth. This is an apologetic statement. You see, the pagan cultures of the day had pagan deities. And the psalmist here is saying, no, Yahweh's sovereignty is over all realms. Yahweh alone is God. The source of help comes from Yahweh. Now, the added benefit to that, and this is probably true for us today as well, that when you know that deep in your heart, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but when you know that, that has an effect on the world around you, the people that are around you. When your security is found in the God, the maker of heaven and earth, dare I say that you're untouchable when it comes to crises. Because you know God's plan will not be thwarted, and you trust him in those situations. And so often preachers will talk about the believers having the non-anxious presence of Christ. That's what it is. In the most anxious moments, Christians are not. That's not always the case. But the psalmist is saying here, stop in the middle of that darkness and recite what is true about your God. So as you look at verses 1 and 2, I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. The next 6 verses will be a response, really, to the idea that God is who he says he is. The writer of this psalm will now prove, because of God's character, that he's worthy to be trusted. His conviction is met in the very character of God. Look at verses 3 and 4. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither sleep nor slumber. We see the word keep twice there. You're going to see it 6 times in these verses. 6 times. This is also creational language. The word keep we find in the creation story first when God gives the command to Adam to work and keep his garden. Work from the Hebrew is translated production. He's to produce. The garden is to produce. And keep is most accurately rendered protection. So those are the 2 things that Adam is to do. He's to produce and to protect. That's his role given to him by God. So we look at this word keep, and it's in relationship to God now. And it appears 6 times. You could translate it watch over or guard. And what it's saying here is that he watches like a father looking over his children as they sleep. Now, this protection doesn't mean that you're never going to trip or stub your toe as a traveler on this journey to God and with God. It doesn't mean that you'll never get injured or suffer or even die. Here's what it does mean. It means that God's purposes can't be thwarted. So the first picture that we get here is the author saying, he will not let your foot be moved. He will not let your foot slip. It can be rendered that way. Well, God cannot steady slipping feet or protect the steps of his servants from a distance. God travels with his people, and this is crucial. He's close, he's near, he can guide your steps. So God is keeping or guarding for those on a journey. It's extended to the whole of our life, to the challenging circumstances, maybe not a literal journey, but just all of the circumstances and situations we would find ourselves in. And this image of a slipping foot is an effort for the author to capture a present danger. So I don't know what present danger is in your life or present anxiety, but God will not let your foot slip. Our pilgrim friend also reminds us that the Lord's protection never ceases. These pagan gods of the day were very human-like in the descriptions that we have from antiquity. They ate and were involved and slept and all these things, kind of like humans. So unlike these pagan gods, the Lord never sleeps. That's what the psalmist is saying. And that's the first qualification for a watchman. A watchman who falls asleep really is a misnomer. No watchman at all. You have to stay awake. It's really hard to guard anything when you're sleeping. In our humanness, we get tired. We get weary. We need sleep. But our God never gets tired, never gets weary. He never needs a timeout or a nap. That's what the psalmist is saying. God will not slumber nor sleep. These two words look synonymous, but they're not necessarily. They appear that way. But the first term refers to kind of a drowsiness of sleep. And the second term is understood more as deep sleep in a traditional sense. But in using those words, the psalmist confesses that the keeper, the God who made heaven and earth, the keeper or guardian of Israel never nods off or dozes, much less falls into a deep sleep, but remains attentive and keeps continual watch over his people, so not even their foot would slip on the path. This is great hope for us. And I listened to Kenan preach last week on the Good Shepherd from Psalm 23. And he stated that the Good Shepherd would see us through to our final destination. And this is what the psalmist is saying here as well. The Lord will keep us from stumbling and get us to our final destination. Our final destination is eternity. And so we have to hold that in perspective with our experiences in life right now. That's difficult to do, but we're going to get there. The next set of verses, 2 verses, 5 and 6. This is the understanding that the Lord is your protection at all times, day and night. So the psalmist again says this: the Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. I understand a little bit about shade and the sun and not getting burned, but I can't say that I've ever been moon burned. However, the psalmist is really drawing out the dangers of nighttime in invoking both the sun and the moon here. But there's a larger picture and you can see it. This now, sun and moon, represents a 24-hour time period. This is both day and night. He's protecting from the dangers of both day and night. And then he's at their right hand. We'll talk about that in just a second. So this speaking figuratively now, this claim that Yahweh provides shade and will protect him from the searing heat of sun and the dangers of the moon by night, and then says he's at your right side. Well, you've probably heard this in another sermon, but Psalms and other places in Scripture talk about this protection coming on the right side. That's because soldiers of the day held their shields in their left hand, and the vulnerable side was the right side. So at your weakest and most vulnerable position, that's where God stands. That's what the psalmist is saying. So your right side of the body is no longer exposed, or your most vulnerable place is no longer exposed. So we recognize these threats by day and night, but God stands protective in all of that. Have you ever been worried about your particular circumstances? You know, that thought that kind of rushes up and you stop for a moment and go, just feels overwhelming. Let me go a little bit deeper here. Have you ever been asleep at night and then woken up with that dread? My wife can attest to me having that issue in my lifetime any number of times when you're tossing and turning and these fears are entering your mind and your heart. You know what it feels like. You've got to worry, and you start to worry about that, and that fires the whole thing, and pretty soon you're 5 worries down the road, and you can't sleep. And you lie awake at night in pain. Well, Psalm 121 would be a good psalm to memorize. And in that moment, recite it. It would be wonderful if my wife could remember that and then sing it to me in that moment. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Some of you are laughing. It would be beautiful to me that she could remind me that the Lord stands between me and every single threat. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. This is difficult because we live in a tension when the ruggedness and the darkness of circumstances are very real. And this sounds really good, but in the moment, I'm wilting underneath the pressure of the circumstances or the fear. It's true. However, Jesus was really clear to say to his followers, do not fear one who can kill the body. Fear the one who can kill body and soul. If you have put your trust in Jesus Christ, then there is for you no fear of death, seemingly. It is something that you can recite and understand that you're protected from. I read a book a number of years ago called Shadow Divers, and it's really the story of one man and some friends who were special forces in the Vietnam War. And they came home, and of course, they had done lots of practice and training in scuba and underwater things, and they started to dive, and it became this big obsessive thing for them. They started diving on some of the deepest wrecks, and they actually started using all kinds of equipment that was brand new, rebreathers and different things, and set all kinds of records for being down the longest and the deepest and all those things. It was a fascinating book. I think some of you would really like it, but rather tedious in some spots. But there was one place in here where he's recounting his life, and he lists 10 things that he learned in his lifetime. Wasn't a believer, but he had these 10 things that he learned. I'll just pick out one for you. I think it came about fourth. In Vietnam, he was on a fire team, and that team was in the jungle and out searching out the enemy. And he oftentimes was called upon and volunteered to walk point. 6 to 10 guys in a small unit, and walking point, you were the first guy into the jungle and the others behind you. and yours was to seek out the danger and be aware. And they were spaced so that if there was any ambush, only the first guy would get killed. These guys would have a way to defend themselves. Walking Point was as scary a place as you could be. And he talked about how excruciating it was to do that. But after he'd done it a number of times, he came to the conclusion that he was a dead man, that he was going to die walking point. And as soon as he came to that conclusion, he said, what I learned was that I became the most dangerous man. Because now I didn't fear death. And my sensitivities were alerted, and my logic was much more clear in the moment. The passion of fear wasn't upon me. I was a walking dead man. It's terribly encouraging for me because I'm always looking for that inspiring story. I'm not saying that you have to grab a hold of it, but I do believe that's a biblical truth. Paul said that it was for him to die was gain, but for him to live was Christ. If you have put your trust in Jesus, you're a walking dead man or woman. And fear is not to be the same thing as the world fears. For your eternity is secure. Jesus' most oft-spoken words were, "Fear not." The reservation for fear in the Bible is just one place. Fear the Lord. That's the beginning of all wisdom. It's a crucial point. What we reserve for God alone is fear. No one else is to get our fear, because it can't touch us. Read Romans chapter 8. Nothing can separate you from the love of Christ. Nothing. It's critical for us to have that theology deep inside us, that it actually gets lived out. I, for one, have claimed many times in my life to be a practical atheist. I understand intellectually the truths that God has given to me as his child, that he loves me, that my sin is forgiven, and I'll live with him in eternity. But I've definitely wrestled with the idea that I know he loves me, I just don't think he likes me. And you know where this is going. I want to get some of my work in there. Like, God, I'll show you that I'm worthy of your love. I will work hard. I'll try not to sin. I'll try and confess quickly, he said jokingly. I will try to do these things because I believe that you'll like me. That's not the gospel. That's me not having a practical theology. And the same would be true of this fear concept. The fear is reserved for God only. And I've tried to teach it to my kids and my grandkids. What does it mean? And in it, all I've tried to say, in sometimes really bizarre fashion, I've tried to give them a picture, but basically, fear is the highest form of worship. So only give it to God. Don't give it to anything else. It's not worthy. Those things are not worthy of your fear. Well, this psalmist is saying, hey, day, night, doesn't matter. This God who made heaven and earth protects you, keeps you. Okay. The fourth strophe, it's a technical term, but it's a kind of a stair-step progression, an apologetic of God's character, comes in verses 7 and 8. This is the God, the Lord, who will protect your whole life. He's always watching, always caring, and now the extent of it is across the whole of your life. The psalmist has developed an argument that begins with God the Creator and Israel's confession of Yahweh. That's in verses 3 and 4. And he now ends with a declaration of personal trust in his protection. Now, just a reminder, God cannot steady the slipping feet or protect the steps of his servants from a distance. He's got to be up close and personal. God travels with his people, and consequently, he will keep you from all evil. That's his promise. The Lord's watch care, if you will, is comprehensive. Doesn't matter where you go in this universe, he's there and protecting. Doesn't matter where you are in the whole of your life, he is there. It's not compartmentalized. He's in your workplace, in your home, at church, on the ball field, in the pub, at dinner. He is there. All harm, your whole life, you're going out and you're coming in. It's actually more often spoken of as a military term here, of the army going out and God protecting them, and coming in and God protecting them. But I think it's too narrow. It's way wider than that. The psalmist is saying this is the whole of your life that God protects. It's comprehensive protection. And last week, I listened to Kenan preach a very strong sermon on the Good Shepherd. And he said, even when we go through the darkest valley, your Good Shepherd protects you. We can fear no evil because our shepherd is with us. And he will see to it that we arrive at our heavenly destination. Is that good news? I hope so. We have confidence that the maker of heaven and earth stands as keeper, guardian. But our confidence is found in the character of God, who helps and protects us in all aspects of our life. So what do we know? We know that nothing, absolutely nothing, is left to chance or fate. That's true. The Lord helps and protects his own, and it's demonstrated through his character. We just walked through it. He guards your steps. He never sleeps. He shades and protects both day and night. He keeps you from all evil all the time. Life is a journey. The journey is dangerous. Our meager human resources, our finite resources and attempts at security will fall woefully short. That news from that doctor to this young couple, there was nowhere to turn. We tried. Call mom. Our faith was small, but God met us there. He will protect when all of our resources fall short. When we belong to God, when you and I belong to God, we do not walk alone. God is with us. But rather, we're helped and guarded by nothing less than the one who made heaven and earth. One of my favorite stories, I don't know how many times I've recounted this, comes from the book of Luke. Perhaps that's my favorite book. I don't know. It is the institution of the Lord's Supper. And it's a lengthy passage, but needless to say, we're going to come to the table here in just a minute. And I'm always reminded of this when I think of fear and what's going on in my world and what's about to happen. And Jesus has walked through the whole cup and the bread and preached to his disciples and has handed them this new covenant. Immediately after that, though, a dispute arose among them as to who was going to be the greatest. It's fascinating how you can take the most holy moment and in a heartbeat turns unholy. As a youth pastor, I watched it over and over. Anyway, Jesus affirms them in that moment, says, you're the ones that have stood by me in my trials. Relax. Who serves among you? Is it not the one reclining at the table? But I'm among you as the one who serves, and you're the ones that have stayed with me in my trials. Then it drops down to a passage that's the one that I want to zero in on here. He turns to Peter. Now, he's already renamed Peter. Peter was named Simon, but he renames him Petra, or rock. And I think he likes Peter the most. You're saying to me, well, can God really do that? Well, I don't know, but Jesus speaks to Peter more than anybody else in Scripture. I mean, in the New Testament. Now, John says he was the favorite, though, right? So there's an argument there. But he turns to Peter and calls him by his first name. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. And in those moments that get dark and the circumstances get so overpowering, you can feel like you're being sifted. It's interesting to note that Jesus said, but I told him to get lost, Simon. He wants to sift you like wheat, and I told him to get out. That's not what he says. Peter, this rock of a man, prideful to some degree. I think Peter had a sidebar conversation with Satan and said, yeah, take what you will from him, sift him down. When you get to the bottom, though, there'll be a pebble. And that pebble is mine. It's the faith that I placed in Peter, and you can't have that. And my hand is wrapped around it. This is what he says to Simon. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Okay, this just flipped the whole thing on its head. I thought I was supposed to pray. I thought you and I were supposed to pray to Jesus. And Jesus has turned around and said, Peter, I've prayed for you. And it's true, and you can read in other parts of Scripture that Jesus intercedes on our behalf for our sake. So when the dark moment comes or the rugged journey is before you, understand that Jesus prays for you. And if the God of the universe, who made heaven and earth, prays for you, who can touch you? No one. So we come to this table. And I, for one, am so grateful that some of you practices this weekly, that you would come to the table weekly. This helps us to remember God with skin and bone. It can all sound so ethereal at times. We can't quite get our mind around the idea of this almighty God. But God has provided a way for us to know through Jesus. This is a time of response for that truth. You have heard the word preached. We've sung the word. Now you're going to eat the word, the living word of Jesus. We're going to flood our souls with his grace. That's what the table represents. In Hebrews, this is what the author says about Jesus from chapter 2. Just listen. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. You're not a slave. You're not a slave to death. Jesus has set you free because he put death to death. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, God with skin and bone, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. The table represents the grace that God gives to you and I, pilgrims on this journey. There is a requirement for coming to the table. I hate to tell you this, but here's the only people that are allowed at the table. Only sinners are allowed at this table. Only sinners. If you have no sin, this table's not for you. It doesn't have any magic. Now, this table is only for those who have recognized that they have sin and they're in need of a Savior. And then it is the very grace of God, extraordinary grace, that represents the washing away of all your sin. And God being present with you in every circumstance of your life. So, I call you to the table this morning to come and feast on Jesus, the God who keeps you in all circumstances, who guards you, who loves you.